great. Thank you so much. So I'd like to take a step back. I recently authored a report called Making Big Tech Pay for the News They Use, and I did a global review of all of the legislation and regulation being proposed or even discussed around the world. And so I want to talk about the different types of approaches, as well as the specific issues that I would suggest policymakers should be considering. And so with that, I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and hopefully it will show you the slideshow. All right. Are you able to see the slideshow? Excellent. Great. Okay. So first of all, I'm not going to spend time on the context. You all know this. We all know this. But I think that we'll get to the point about how this context ends up getting interpreted in these different legislative frameworks. So there's an overarching aim to improve media viability and sustainability. Obviously, that's critical in democracies and elsewhere. And ultimately, the goal is to generate new revenues or subsidies for news outlets. And those end up having different types of solutions in terms of the policy solutions. Some of the key considerations that policymakers want to be thinking about is how to establish the evidence of the link between traffic and revenue. And that's honestly one of the things that we just really don't know. Looking at self-regulatory structures versus government decision-making and distribution, and kind of the broader infrastructure that exists in the digital economy. And I'm going to discuss that at the end, because I think, it's great to talk about pursuing certain approaches, but you need to make sure that you have the legal, the regulatory, the trust infrastructure at the basis of that. So there are essentially 5 main policy areas that these various different approaches kind of pick and choose from. So one is taxation. And a key assumption kind of underpinning that is that, the revenues that are accruing to these tech companies are not being adequately, obviously, allocated to news outlets that are producing, as has been mentioned, really high quality content. And I would just say that this idea that, Facebook keeps saying, only 3% of traffic is to news. I think we have to disabuse them of that notion. And it disregards the fact that they are funding fact checking a lot on their platform. So obviously they want high quality news. So we need to get rid of that, that rhetoric. I think we still do not have good evidence, and this is where the media can come in about the actual link there, and I'll get into that in a moment. So essentially, policymakers have coalesced around interventions that focus on taxation, intellectual property, competition law, which means giving people different bargaining rights, requiring platforms to pay licensing fees, requiring them to negotiate for that, taxing digital advertising and using the resulting revenues to subsidize publishers, and subsidies paid directly or indirectly to news outlets, for example, through citizen vouchers or tax credits, and mandating transparency from platforms. So with respect to the ad tech ecosystem, I think as India and your competition authority or DNPA's submission emphasized, the opacity and complexity of the ad tech supply chain compounds the difficulty of publishers who want to create these revenue streams. And again, we just do not really have good evidence about the link. There are a couple of studies right after some new legislation was passed in Europe, but we don't have long-term, we don't have comprehensive studies. So I am just going to note that there is this labyrinth of data management and kind of different platforms and exchanges that are involved in the ad tech ecosystem, which means that publishers get a reduced portion of the money spent by advertisers. There's a lack of data and traceability to even know where a lot of that money is going. And one study found that the UK regulator estimated that on average, more than 35% of advertising value went to intermediaries rather than publishers, and a third of that was unaccounted for. So obviously there are many I think this also points to the fact that we should be looking to the advertising industry as here you have the advertising industry involved, which is great, as an ally in this effort. So if we're looking at one of the approaches, it's about leveling the playing field, and so you have the US, Canada, Australia trying to increase the news media bargaining power. This means removing anti-competition barriers to collective action, as you know. But there is another approach to antitrust kind of pro-competition interventions, which is aimed at reducing information asymmetries. Or the dominance in particular aspects of the marketplace. And so these can focus on algorithmic transparency and increasing transparency into the digital advertising market. So I think we want to see transparency as a specific type of intervention as well. As the first country, as has been mentioned, like Australia has really kind of set the bar, but also highlighted some of the issues and criticisms with the law. It's, as was mentioned, that's benefiting large news outlets rather than small. That may or may not be a concern. Like that is something definitely in the United States that helped, I think, kill the bill yesterday that was put into the National Defense Authorization Act. But I think we have to ask ourselves, like, why don't we also want to support large news organizations? And if you can be proactive about that, that might be helpful, because actually in Brazil, Facebook was able to align with small independent publishers and kill their effort there to have a similar type of approach. On the positive side, I think Australia explicitly included public service media in its framework, which is something that has garnered support in Canada. And in exchange, that public service media agreed to spend that money on journalists in rural and regional areas. So I think this is another way you can look at this type of work to accomplish multiple goals. For example, addressing news deserts and serving underserved or marginalized populations. The use of these mandatory arbitration clauses is another kind of commonality that we see in here. This idea that there are anti-retaliation provisions are another common feature that are aimed at creating a more equal playing ground and insulating news organizations from platform pressure. So I think Taylor mentioned earlier that, the Canada's draft bill would allow news organizations to actually join a negotiated deal after the fact, which is great because maybe your news organization didn't exist yet or didn't know about how to join or wanted to see what was going to happen before joining in. So I think that's really helpful. We have two main pieces of legislation here in the US that are aimed at supporting local news. One is the Journalist Competition and Preservation Act, JCPA, which you heard was just not passed in the NDAA yesterday, and the US Local Journalism Sustainability Act. So the JCPA is an antitrust collective bargaining approach. The Journalism Sustainability Act is about giving credits and to news consumers to choose how they allocate that, and then to credit taxes for local journalism. So the key issues that all of these approaches take are figuring out really at the core of it, the definition of news publisher or the beneficiary of this legislation. So all of these approaches raise fundamental questions about how to define news media beneficiaries, how to distribute benefits, and who makes the decision about how. And so to this end, it's really important that policymakers need to be clear about the objective of their intervention and their theory of change. And that they try to create processes that insulate news media from political interference, and which don't further dependency on platforms for funding or survival, because again, we might see that these platforms don't become the most important. So think about how to do this without being very specific on platforms. And we have to be realistic about the risk of capture. So the risk of capture is higher in countries with high levels of cronyism or political interference in the news industry, or low levels of press freedom more broadly. And as we know, governments around the world have a track record of using their budgetary influence via taxation, subsidies, government advertising, et cetera, to influence or capture the media. So any sort of legislation needs to be designed in a way to preserve editorial independence. And it stands to reason that the further that the intervention is from the content related products, and the greater the independence of the mechanisms for defining beneficiaries is from the government, the lower the risk of media capture. So, definitions, again, are a key focal point. Here are some of you can see on the screen, some of the issues that each piece of legislation needs to address. Defining press publishers, how is that done? I, in my report, have a chart showing kind of how these are done by different types of government interventions. Because, by definition, if you adopt an ancillary copyright or any sort of beneficiary, you're going to have to define who that is. So these decisions can be made by government. They can be made by self-regulatory associations like journalism associations, et cetera. I think the idea is don't put that decision in any one specific body. If there are multiple news, press councils, digital news associations, professional bodies, like that's a great way to go. Or you can put that into the hands of citizens and individual taxpayers to decide essentially by where their vouchers go or where their tax credits are spent. And of course, one of the things that differentiates these approaches is whether or not they require transparency into the deals. I think one of the best practices that is emerging and which we saw added into the JCPA is to make sure that at least there's some minimal reporting. I don't think we want to get into details here, but there should be at least some minimal reporting to a central authority so it's easier to provide oversight and review of that. So if you look at the two US approaches, the JCPA and the Sustainability Act, you can see that they're taking different approaches. The idea of providing tax credits, that could be, or vouchers to citizens, can be a really interesting intervention because that could accomplish more than just the goal of improving news media sustainability. It might also encourage people to read the news, to engage with the news, and increase media literacy, which is another public policy goal in many cases. And so you can see how these different, these two acts have chosen to define journalism, define thresholds, and that's something that, policymakers are going to need to consider. What is the regional requirement? Is it about where the staff is located? Is it about what the audiences that are served? Is there a size requirement? So another intervention that I think has gotten a little bit less attention is transparency interventions, and this is designed at addressing information asymmetries. So greater transparency would serve a broad range of goals, including media sustainability, which also means that you might be able to get more support from across different communities. So there is really no agreement about the level of transparency that should be required with respect to licensing deals, as you heard earlier from Taylor. But we do see that, there does seem to be this trend towards requiring some sort of central reporting. And you can also look at transparency as dealing with algorithmic transparency. First, advertising, I mentioned there's a lot of seepage, so improving transparency around ad tech would improve that. Algorithmic transparency, you see that in the Australian News Media Bargaining Code. That is around the idea that the decisions that the platforms make have a very real economic impact on news organizations, and so they should be advised in advance. I think that we call this algorithmic transparency, but it could also be, in some cases, it's policy transparency and advance notice. So if you're going to pivot away from video or pivot to video, there should be transparency and accountability. Of course, we know that Facebook ended up lying about that. So sorry, little trigger happy here. Okay, and then there's some aspect of transparency which we have not addressed in many of these frameworks, which is other types of platform support to news media. So I think it would be helpful to think about how there could be also reporting requirements for platforms to at least provide a basic centralized information into the news organizations that they're providing funding to, again, to increase transparency. And in general, there should be a principle that if you're doing independent, good journalism, you're going to be transparent about your ownership and your funding on that. So, we mentioned earlier, I think Paul mentioned, the adoption of copyright laws. And so there is this idea of, rethinking intellectual property rights to include copyright for news snippets and headlines, and thinking about where to draw the line with fair use. On the one hand, headlines, photos, and snippets that show up may drive traffic and potentially generate revenue, referral traffic, as opposed to direct or organic traffic, which is often more valuable. In Europe, they have already adopted this through the EU copyright directive, and there's been a lot of up in arms about, this is a link tax, this is going to break the internet. The internet does still work in Europe, so good news. We have not seen that this breaks the internet, so this is another thing that regulators are looking at. The US, however, just decided that the Copyright Office said that we would not be getting a new collective ancillary copyright law. So I think there's still a lot of concern about that. So this is an area where more evidence would be helpful. And one of the things that you have to think about with ancillary copyright laws is you need to have industry associations and collecting agencies that can implement a monitoring and payment distribution system, which requires transparency and trust to function. So even where there are adequate publishers associations and existing royalties rights management associations, there must be authorities with the competence and the capacity to monitor and enforce compliance. And the fact is, in a lot of countries that doesn't exist. It seems like India probably does have that sort of basis, so that might be helpful. So as I mentioned, my report really was looking at how possible are these approaches that are coming from the so-called global north, the countries that often have a seat at the table. How can they be used by the majority world, which is also called the global south? So I think, some these overarching challenges are the lack of information and access to data to inform this policy making. So it'd be helpful if regulators could come up with a common set of standards around what type of information should be collected. And that shouldn't be just, one country or the other. The lack of influence and market share, that's not an issue for India. You guys are in a really good position because you have a really important market share and therefore more influence. As I mentioned, there is this varying regulatory capacity and often a knowledge and skills gap in government. So also congrats to you for doing this briefing and really, taking the time to try to figure out, what are these different models? And then, of course, the institutional configuration, the legal, financial, and technical infrastructure. That means you need IP and copyright law. Where does that fit into other priorities? These professional media industry and publisher associations and collecting societies are a really important component that we don't often talk about. And so you need to look at what systems do you have in place? And then again, these systems to monitor. And then I have some recommendations, but I'm going to end there and stop sharing. And just to say, I think that if you look at all of these various different types of approaches, one of the things that can be helpful is if we think globally on the transparency aspect and data needs to actually collaborate on a global common framework, which might help then many countries pursue this and show some level of consensus around there. And I think with that, I'll just stop and open for any questions.